talk at Niagara University. It's going to start in about 3 minutes.
Oh, no, I wasn't saying take off your hat. I was saying hi.
Look at your head.
It'll remind him that he's in Buffalo area. Yeah, for the most part, we call it the tri-state area, so Pennsylvania. You know, you're all one big, yeah, you're like your own tri-state area in itself, bigger. Yeah. We don't consider what we call the one state, which is New York City, to be part of us. It's a different world. Yeah, I guess it is. I guess we'll get started, just in the interest of making sure that we have enough time for everything we want to do. So thank you all for coming out. This is the first of our spring social justice speaker and discussion series events, and we are really excited about this. And I have to say, based on my own personal research, this is a talk that I've been hoping that we could actually bring to campus for a couple of years. And I've been thinking about this for a long time after watching, I can't remember if it was We Are Legion or one of the hacktivist films, I thought.
Either We Are Legion or Hacker Wars.
Yeah,
or,
I thought Barrett Brown would be a great person to bring out here. And then for a whole series of other reasons more recently. As you all know from the flyers that were out, he's an award-winning journalist, wrote a series while he was in prison that received the National Magazine Award in the category of columns and opinion. And he has a book coming out in February 2020, My Glorious Defeats, Hacktivist Narcissist Anonymous, a memoir. Yeah, I do too. His Pursuance project is one of the major things that he's working on at this point. It's described as offering a fully encrypted ecosystem to activists or journalists whose efforts might vex more powerful entities. And it has a board of directors that includes an Icelandic parliamentarian, CIA whistleblowers, and CIA officer.
ex-CIA officers.
Okay, X's. All right, all X's. And also including Thomas Drake, who actually was on campus, I believe, 2 years ago. But that's not the introduction that I want to give. I want to read the introduction that he actually wrote, not intending it to be an introduction, but in a 2015 article for Intercept, in describing himself and the way that he's been perceived in the media and in a variety of other ways. He says, the surreal details of the case itself may be found in any number of mainstream and not so mainstream news articles from which you will learn that I was the official spokesman for Anonymous, or perhaps the unofficial spokesman for Anonymous, or maybe simply the self-proclaimed spokesman for Anonymous, or alternatively the guy who denied being the spokesman for Anonymous over and over again, sometimes on national television, to no apparent effect. You'll also find that I was either a conventional journalist, an unconventional journalist, a satirist who despised all journalists, an activist, a whistleblower, a nihilistic and self-absorbed cyberpunk adventurer out to make a name for himself, or, and I quote, an underground commander in a new kind of war, as NBC's Brian Williams put it, no doubt exaggerating. He goes on to say, according to the few FBI files that the Bureau has thus far made public, and there are many more now, I'm a militant anarchist revolutionary who once teamed up with Anonymous in an attempt to overthrow the US government, and on another, presumably separate occasion, I plotted unspecified attacks on the government of Bahrain, which, if true, would really seem to be between me and the King of Bahrain, would it not? There's also a book out there that claims I'm from Houston, whereas in fact I spit on Houston. As to the truth on these and other matters, I'm going to play coy for now, as whatever else I may be, I'm definitely something of a coquette. All you really need to know for the purposes of this column is that I'm some sort of eccentric writer who lives in a prison, and I may or may not have it out for the King of Bahrain. So he's no longer in prison clearly, but let's all welcome Barrett Brown.
So,
gonna jump right into it. Beyond those mutually exclusive press descriptions that he just read from my column a number of years ago, day after my arrest, my hometown paper, the Dallas Morning News, wrote that although I had not been charged, they couldn't get the FBI or the Dallas police to explain why I had been arrested, they went ahead and just guessed anyway. And I was supposedly I had quote, claimed responsibility for taking down the Church of Scientology and also for attacks on MasterCard and Visa in defense of WikiLeaks. None of that quite happened. There have been other, New York Times has referred to me both as just Barrett Brown in some things, not having thought of a title. The spokesman, self-proclaimed spokesman. There is a huge and really depressing body of articles on me that all contradict each other, and the great lesson of which is that the press is worse than you think. Now, most people today claim to be critical of the press. They claim not to trust the press, but in practice, everyone trusts the press. Everyone trusts that when they see something in print, it is coming from some omnipotent black box that has some degree of intentionality and some degree of deliberate, effective, omnipotent understanding of our world that we do not have as individuals. And so that's why people who claim, that the press is either all run by the intelligence community, or it's all run for profit, or it's all run by the corporations, when it comes down to it, they will assume what the press is telling them, unless it's something that challenges them ideologically. They will assume it is correct, and they will repeat it. And that applies to other journalists. That is less of a problem than it would be for the American citizenry, different than it was. Every generation since, Cato, and probably before, thinks that the previous generation was better than the current one. That's always been the case. Today, I think it may be actually true in some respects. To this generation that you're a part of, and I'm somewhat a part of, I'm 37, I'm younger than I look, or older than I look, we are superior to the previous generations in this country in some ways. We are more likely to have a sense of the humanity of the other. We are less likely to, the sort of propaganda films you see put out by the U.S. military back in the 50s and 60s would not work today. But other propaganda works very well. There are two intertwining subjects, phenomena, that will make your lives increasingly hellish over the next 20, 30 years. I say your lives because I'll be leaving the country pretty soon when my probation is over. One of those is the press's haphazardness, its lack of civic virtue, the lack on the part of a given journalist, the lack on the part of most journalists and editors to really care about what it is that they're doing. The failure to connect what their work is to what it actually is, what it constitutes for this republic. When you have a vastly complex imperial republic like we do, with bases around the world, with fingers in all the pies internationally, and when you have a intelligence apparatus or military apparatus that is beyond anything that anyone could have imagined even just 60 years ago, when you have that and more, you need a press that is capable of determining what is important before it becomes evident, or, barring that, at the very least, determining what is important after it has become evident. So I'm going to give you some examples of how they have failed in this regard and some of the things that we used to look into back in 2011, 2012, which is why we're in prison over. Some of these issues involving what we call the intelligence contracting industry, the private, compartmentalized, delegated, for-profit sector that the Pentagon, CIA, and NSA, and other elements of the U.S. government, the British, and then New Zealand, and Canada, and Australia, increasingly farm out to private companies. And it's going to be a scattered talk. I'm not very organized in my thoughts. And again, like I said, these are very interconnected issues. So we're going to jump from attacking my personal enemies at the New York Times and the New Yorker to describing apparatus that we discovered years ago that involved propaganda online. And we're going to do it just in a fun way, I think. Fun. Only rule is to have fun. Back in 2010, I was still a somewhat conventional freelancer. I had been a journalist or media person my whole life, starting when I was 15 and 16. I went to the University of Texas very briefly, studied journalism, quit very quickly. I had writing jobs and all that. Over the years, I began writing, with the exception of a couple times I had to go work as a furniture mover. I was a freelancer, either a marketing copywriter when I had to be, or writing, local features for magazines in Texas when I could. And then when I really could, writing for policy journals or occasionally something that anyone had ever heard of, which was always nice. One of the first articles I wrote that was actually an article that actually mattered was about Texas prisons, new Texas prison regulations that were passed in, I think, 2004 or 5, and that the Texas Board of Corrections had just passed, and which had basically the effect was to prevent journalists and of all sorts, whether it be with newspapers or writing books or magazine articles or whatever, from talking to inmates. And the problem with that, one of the problems with that, is that the way that inmates in places like Texas, and the Texas state system, which is one of the worst systems in the country, which is saying quite a bit, one of the ways in which these things get, these issues that happen get brought to attention and corrected is for the press to find out about them. It doesn't always work, but it's one of the few ways in which that happens. I didn't know back then, I had not yet done 4 years in prison, federal prison, with guys who had been in the state before, so I didn't know back then how bad it was. I didn't know that I would someday be sharing a cell with a guy who had been made to fight with a guard, when he was about 19 years old, in an organized gladiator-proof combat. That's a scandal that also happened in Louisiana a few years ago. I didn't know the degree to which they needed that coverage, but they did. And I wrote this article for a very small, obscure policy journal. It's been around 50 years, called Towards Freedom. And I wrote it, got my $150 check for this little article. Now I had something I could, when I queried other publications, I could say I've written for this, this, and this. So I was building my way up, in terms of a resume, in terms of being able to get attention, get a foot in the door in other publications. And I realized that I had achieved nothing whatsoever, except for me. My career had now had another sort of pillar to it that I could advance upon, but I had done nothing for any inmates. I did nothing for the citizenry, even to the extent that people reading this magazine are already going to agree that we need prison reform. Now they know just how worse it is. That's it. There's not much they can do about it. But I thought years from now, when I rise up, when I write for larger outlets, that's when I'll have an impact. That's when journalism, as it's supposed to be, under a republic, that's when that will all kick in, and all of this will have been worth it. And so years later, when I started writing for The Guardian and Vanity Fair and Huffington Post and New York Press and whatever else I wrote for back then, it occurred to me again that still I was not having an impact. And that not only was I not having an impact, with rare instances, with rare exceptions, no one was having an impact. So even when journalism was done right, which it sometimes is, it's not enough. Unless you have a citizenry and an apparatus around that citizenry that is really capable of taking that information and running with it and making something happen with it, you might as well not have a press. You're just providing jobs for journalism graduates, that's it. Obviously, you don't want to overstate the case. There's a lot of things that the press does, that it accomplishes, and the citizenry takes the ball on, or Congress itself, even without worrying about if it's going to matter in the next election, will run the ball. There are people that believe in things. There are people who, even if they don't believe in things, they're ambitious and they want to be seen as that. There's all kinds of ways in which a fractured, very imperfect press apparatus and a fractured libertarian republic can still get things done in ways that are important. And oftentimes that involves issues becoming just so large that they can no longer be ignored. Sometimes it involves, again, as we might hope, really good journalism that finds the problem before it really kicks in and gets it addressed by an attentive and virtuous Congress. That happens sometimes. It didn't happen in 2011. Late 2010, I got invited into an internet relay chat, which is one of the major nodes from which Anonymous operated. Now, Anonymous had been an amorphous kind of internet culture that had come out of 4chan, back in 4chan, before 4chan became kind of a right-wing incubator, which it became while I was in prison, apparently. It was not intended to be an activist movement. It was a joking, it was a way to have fun. It was a way to troll video games. It was a way to turn existing games like Second Life into a different kind of game, where we're sort of running espionage operations to no end, and accidentally learning skills that would later actually come out to be useful, shockingly enough. But it did become an activist movement in a way that we don't have time to get into now, but it's very accidentally, by pure accident, it became one by the time I got involved. And in late 2010, some of the anonymous participants who had been working on things like fighting censorship legislation in Australia and fighting back against the Church of Scientology when it tried to censor the internet to keep its materials off the internet, all of those things kind of coalesced, and there was several nodes of activity where people who cared and had certain skills came together and they worked on operations. They did it for free. They weren't paid for it. They did it at risk to themselves. Some of them did it because they were hackers and they enjoyed hacking things. Some of them did it because they were social engineers and they enjoyed that. Some of them did it because they had nothing else to do. There was different kinds of motivating factors. But they all were capable now of engaging in these really massive, unprecedented operations that were highly agile, and that a lot of intelligence agencies and militaries around the world would have envied, and did come to envy the next year. When I was invited in, there was several people who were anonymous participants in this server called AnonOps, which we'll call it from now on AnonOps, who were Tunisian nationals. And right then, in part because of a WikiLeaks release through the New York Times, the Washington Post, back when WikiLeaks was still working with actual press outlets, some documents had come out about the Ben Ali regime, which was the Tunisian dictatorship that had been in place for the last 20, 30 years. Just kind of emphasizing what Tunisians already knew, which was their government was corrupt, and that the U.S. doesn't care, and that certain other countries were supporting that regime for their own interests. Coincidentally, or perhaps not coincidentally, a fruit vendor in Tunis, Tunisia, the capital city, set himself on fire to protest some local police who had taken his cart. He hadn't paid the bribe, and they took away his livelihood. He set himself on fire. And this, for whatever reason, set the Tunisian people into this insurrection, which is not something they were used to doing. Tunisia's last insurrection was the one that put the Ben Ali regime in power some 25 years before. It was news. It was not usual. But to someone who, let's say, is in the press in the West, and who has a vague idea of the Middle East or no interest in learning about these things when they come up, it just sounded like, oh, the Arabs they're on the streets again. It's not anything worth addressing. So it wasn't reported. There was literally one article about the Tunisian insurrection before Anonymous got involved around New Year's 2011. So because there were some Tunisian nationals in Anonymous, it was proposed that Anonymous get involved. And because I had been writing about Anonymous for the last year, there were certain people in there who were heavily involved who said Barrett Brown might be interested in this and he might have some ideas, so I was brought in. And for a number of reasons, including the press operations that Anonymous did, and including the fact that they took over the government's internet infrastructure, their cyber infrastructure, took over their websites, took over a lot of the police servers, and disrupted them. We were able to prevent some of the people who ended up getting arrested and tortured, to take them out of the equation, from being arrested and tortured. Some were. One guy's name was Slim Amanu. He was an anonymous participant from that non-op server. I only knew him for a couple of days then because he was arrested on January 4th, I believe, held for 4 days, tortured. But 2 weeks later, they had won, and Slim Amanu was now a member of the provisional government. We had our first Anon regime. That was obviously interesting time, and the revolution was now called the Arab Spring. It spread to Egypt, it spread to Algeria to some extent. Morocco forestalled it. The King of Morocco put in some reforms rather than deal with these unknowns. There was this dynamic whereby even the idea that Anonymous was now involved, and this was supported by the press in the U.S., particularly Michael Hastings, who was a friend of mine back then and who later died in 2013. This was supported by their cooperation, by their tendency to find Anonymous to be a more interesting aspect than the revolution itself. So if you go look at articles about the Tunisian Revolution in early 2011, you will see articles that talk about Anonymous taking over these websites, replacing them with messages to Tunisian people, providing these scripts to Tunisian activists to prevent them from being identified over Facebook by the Tunisian government, and as it turned out, French and the U.S. Intelligence contracting firms. You'll read about all that, but you won't have any indication there's an actual revolution going on. You won't have any indication that Tunisian people have had an uprising, because they were getting information from us, and they weren't paying attention to the other part, and there was nothing they could look at in the news, which is where they get their news, most journalists, to indicate there was a revolution going on, to indicate there was actual insurrection going on, that it had spread beyond the capital city by this point. That's interesting, of course, and it tells us a little bit about how haphazard and how important, nonetheless, information operations are. that'll come up later. So we were working on these things, and in Bahrain and Egypt and all that, we're sitting here in these servers. I have a group called Project PM that was originally created, again, with Michael Hastings and a few other people, 2009, with the intention of creating something else, an apparatus for better information sharing, which was now being used to help develop darknets for Egyptian activists when Egypt's internet was shut down by the government. And then all of a sudden, in late January, well, first a couple things happened. The FBI raids 40 U.S. households, heavily armed raids, puts families, corrals them into their dens on the couch, streams of people, takes all the electronics in the house. There's 5 arrests in Britain on the same day. This was all in response to a DDoS attack, a distributed denial of service attack that had been done under the auspices of Anonymous the previous month. What they had done was a number of people had pointed their internets, pointed their modems at the websites of MasterCard and Visa and PayPal, and taken down like MasterCard's like main corporate advertising website for like 3 seconds, slowed it down for the rest. Something that had no consequence, no impact, and 40 people were raided over that. 40 homes were raided with children. A few days later, a guy named Aaron Barr, who's an ex-Navy intelligence fellow, who runs a company called HB Gary Federal, based in Virginia, one of a number of intelligence contracting firms that have popped up since 9/11. Almost unnoticed by the press and the citizenry since that time. And he says to the Financial Times, to this guy named Joseph Min, who's a very naive reporter at that and at Reuters as well, he says, I have identified Anonymous' secret leadership. I have gone into the Anon server and I have infiltrated it under my fake name, and I have developed this procedure by which I can determine, I can attribute a screen name, to someone's actual name, using login times on different social networks. And he provides some information that we know not to be true in this article. One of these pieces of information is that a guy named Q had founded Anonymous. Another is that a guy named Owen is about to retire and we're trying to replace him. Now, these things were so untrue that you could just know they were untrue by having a brief, just a basic knowledge of internet culture. Because Anonymous had never been founded, there was no leader, it had arisen in a very haphazard way from an amorphous image board by accident. And so it was very clear that the names that he had, regardless of what else he had, he also had names of people who were not involved with Anonymous, who, were he to actually give them to the FBI, as he said he was going to, would have gotten more people raided in a very distressing way by armed FBI agents for nothing. And even to the extent that if I got the names right, he was coming after people who were working on spreading democracy in North Africa. And so we wrote, me and a guy named Topiary, who's on his real name, so Jake Davis, a good English kid, he was about your age when this happened. We wrote a press release called Anonymous Concedes Defeat, and put it out for the joking, very obscure, those little video game references and stuff, saying, Aaron Barr has captured all the gold rings, and he's gone to our secret headquarters where the press, he found the press room and the anonymous .off stuff, blah, blah. And then the next day, having done that silly thing, the hackers go in and they go to Aaron Barr's company and they take over his server and took all of his notes and 75,000 emails between this firm, HB Gary Federal, the parent firm, HB Gary, the NSA, the FBI, the DOJ, Palantir, and 30 other firms, of which nothing was known at that point. And we take it to the press, and we put the emails online, and we go through them, and we discovered that, yes, his notes were wrong. His notes had nonsense in them. At some point, he lists my name, and he says, I think this guy whose street name is Barrett Brown, all one word, is Barrett Brown. And about a week prior, the New York Times had written about being anonymous in terms of Egypt. So this was stuff that was very, it was mixed. It was a mixed, the results were mixed anyway. And, but beyond that, it turned out that Aaron Barr was also involved in this other operation with these much larger firms, one of which is Palantir. You hear about Palantir more and more these days. Peter Thiel is the founder, big Trump supporter, it's come to be. Someone who plays a larger and larger public role, whereas back then he was more of an enigma. HB Gary, Aaron Barr's firm, Palantir, Peter Thiel's firm, In-Game Systems, which didn't really make it into the press at first, a very secretive firm that works with the NSA on some stuff, and Barrett Systems had all been coming together to create this outfit that would, in exchange for $200,000 a month, conduct information operations against the enemies of whoever. Bank of America, U.S. Chamber of Commerce, those are those two early prospective clients. Bank of America wanted to go after WikiLeaks. They believe that WikiLeaks had information on WikiLeaks had said, we have information on a U.S. bank that's engaged in a lot of wrongdoing. The Bank of America is obviously like, oh shit, we've engaged in a lot of wrongdoing, that must be us. And so they'd gone to the DOJ. The DOJ is like a concierge service for private people. You can go to them apparently and say, hey, we think our crimes must be revealed by this foreign, this bizarre little leak group. What can we do to go after them? The DOJ is like, oh, we'll help you. We're the DOJ. So they put Bank of America and U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which wants to go after like anti-U.S. Chamber of Commerce labor groups and groups like Stop the Chamber, Code Pink, pretty mainstream, vanilla, you know, not exactly the Black Liberation Army kind of things, just people who oppose the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Both of them go to the DOJ. Both of them get put in touch with Hunt & Williams, which is a law firm in D.C. that handles a lot of these black ops things. And I actually met a guy who was executive there recently, like 2 weeks ago, coincidentally. It's kind of fun. Puts in touch with them. They put them in touch with this Team Themis consortium, which is what we call Palantir, what they call themselves, Palantir, HB Gary, blah, blah. And Palantir and HB Gary, blah, 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 as I'm going to call them from now on, they create this document saying, here's what we can do for you. We can go out, Aaron Barr here can find the children of these labor union leaders. He can find the children of these activists on social networking, and he can use that information as leverage. He can create fake documents and give them to leaking groups and pretend that they're from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and pretend that they show some wrongdoing. And then once these groups release them, then we'll point to it and say, ha, they made this up. And we can show that it's fake. So setting up people for fraud charges. All kinds of things that they talked about doing in these things, including hacks, things that would be illegal if we did them and turn out to be illegal when we did them. And this, you know, for once, thanks to this very bizarre sequence of events, became a press subject for about a month. And Aaron Barr had to resign from his company. Palantir, this is the important part. Palantir, they first claimed that they had no idea what was on those slides, those documents. They found them abhorrent and they would never be involved in that. And then oops, here's some emails saying, oh, here's actually one of your guys helping write those documents, and here's your company logo on the documents. So like, oh well, actually it turns out there's this one guy who works for us that was involved in this, and we're very upset with him. We're gonna put him on leave. New York Times finally, after everyone else has done all the actual journalism, New York Times comes in and writes a summary of this, including the Palantir stuff, including writing about this one engineer, Matthew Steckman. And then that's it. They're done with the story. There's 75,000 emails. It took all 24 hours to find like some really extraordinary stuff in there. We're still finding other stuff, but for the most part, with the exceptions, surprising exceptions, of Bloomberg Businessweek and a few other outlets that still have a few good, I think really cogent reporters there, the press was done. The story's over. We found a story, it was really interesting, and now it's over. We're not going to look at these emails anymore, because why? Why would we? So we keep looking through them. And I luckily had a lot of press contacts, luckily had the ability to raise volunteers. And we engaged in what's called a crowdsourced sort of research campaign into these emails, to other emails that were hacked in the next year or so, publicly available documents like tax filings, patents, and we eventually composed on our site, echelon2.org, which has since moved after the FBI raid, a great deal of information about what exists, about what is done. Information like this practice called persona management, which was an apparatus, or remains an apparatus, by which a single, for instance at SITCOM, a single U.S. Air Force airman at Bagram Air Base or McGill Air Base can control 15 entirely fake online individuals with very cohesive, very convincing backgrounds, with AIs or with software that helps facilitate maintaining, not just translating English into Arabic or Farsi, for instance, but maintaining a certain way of writing, way of speaking, way of chatting across different personas. Things like Romas Coin, which is one of the few things that I wrote about myself. Usually we did these kind of, either we would tip off the press and say, hey, you guys can pursue this, here's an email, there's some information, go for it. Or we would have all these volunteers kind of slowly write about them. In this case, I did write about this myself. It was an apparatus that we still are unclear on, but we understand it better now, thanks to recent events, that the U.S. government runs via some unknown division. We don't know if it's Pentagon, we don't know if it's CIA or what, and that involves all kinds of different components, including online cell phone games. It includes natural linguistic processing, which I'm not sure what that is, but it sounds malevolent. It involves Apple and Google. Apple and Google's national security divisions met with Aaron Barr, this guy who, by the time we went through these, had already been found to be going after people's children. And they met with him about this, because he was just, he's another contractor. He's a guy who's worked for Northrop Grumman, he's worked for these other companies, they're all on the same good team. And, whatever, and the U.S. government would not necessarily use anything that they produced for them. So we wrote about all this, and I put it out in The Guardian, which I'm still writing for some reason, and it goes out, and then, former Lieutenant Colonel, who's my guy there, what's his name? This fellow who would reveal the able data program. He was still in the U.S. military. He comes out. He says, "Yes, this is a scary thing. There's detention." Der Spiegel in Germany reports on it. Besides that, the U.S. doesn't care. And so we've done all this stuff really for nothing. We have not really had an impact on these companies. By this point, we spent about 9 months putting ourselves in some great risk to not just go through these emails, acquire them, read them, present them, give them away for free in some cases. And we really haven't made a dent in these things. The only lesson you can pull from that year is that even when we catch these people doing the most indefensible things to undermine democracy itself, they're not the ones that are getting in trouble. We are. So by that time, some of my friends, including Tokyo, they got with the press release with, have already been caught, and they're been arrested in England. We got some more people arrested in the U.S. as well. Another hack happened, Stratfor. A company in Austin called Stratfor, it's called Strategic Forecasting. It does, according to its materials, it provides information to companies who are working abroad in different areas, provides them with intelligence information about the situation on the ground. Turns out what they also really do after this hack occurred is they spy on activists in Bhopal, India, for instance, who are trying to get Dow Chemical to pay restitution for the huge Union Carbide disaster in the 80s that killed several thousand people and maimed tens of thousands of others. These groups that are out there still trying to lobby to get, Dow Chemical to pay money to the survivors. Were being spied on by Stratfor, this company in Austin. They also deal with Coca-Cola. They help them spy on PETA. Coca-Cola came to Stratfor, and they were worried about PETA for some reason. I forgot what they were doing exactly. And Stratfor says in these emails, "Well, we'll just ask the FBI. They'll have some files." So the FBI is sharing files with Coca-Cola about these U.S. citizens who are not necessarily even suspected of committing crimes. You can't go to the FBI yourself, or the DOJ, or the CIA and say, "Hey, I've got a personal enemy. What do you got on them?" You can't. You can try it. It might be interesting, but it won't happen. So right there, you have a real story. You have a story that speaks to something that many of you already understand, in some degree or another. The disparity of citizenship, the de facto sort of technocratic, kleptocratic system that has been built on top of our democracy over the years, and which has not been trimmed away as it should have been, and how it actually works, and what the difference is between being a citizen in an equal society and being a citizen in a allegedly equal society. But that's not anywhere close to the entirety of what we found in those emails. We don't have time to go into all of it, but I wanted to mention that aspect because just to give you a sense of what we're doing. March 2012, a few months after that Stratfor hack, about a year and 1 month after the H.B. Gary hack that really made the DOJ look terrible, that made all these companies look terrible, that disrupted a lot of operations, that's a lot of money that's been spent. I'm raided by the FBI. I had been tipped off the day before. I went to my mom's house, lived in the same city as I did. The FBI knocks on her door. They ask me if I want to give them my laptops. I say, no, I don't want to give you my laptops. They come back and search warrant a few years later, and they raid her place and take a bunch of laptops. Search warrant lists H.B. Gary in-game systems, Project PM, which is my research group, echelon2.org, which is the website which will follow our information. They're not even really trying to hide what it is they're after. Then they threatened to indict my mother, which is what they do. The FBI does that a lot. They will threaten a female loved one, a girlfriend, and all that. They did the same thing to my girlfriend later on, about 6 months later, in order to get you to cooperate, in order to get you to plea or to cooperate or something, which unfortunately I was not going to do. And so things come to a head over the next 6 months. There's some more hacks. I find out what else the FBI has done. I find out that H.B. Gary was the ones who were posting pictures of my house and my mother's house and previous houses I'd lived in that they thought I lived in, and putting them on Twitter to the attention of the Zeta drug cartel, which in another bizarre story we didn't get into, in October 2011, there was a conflict between Anonymous and me in particular and the Zeta drug cartel that kind of grabbed another one of these very bizarre stories that keeps cropping up in this long tail. So I found out a lot of stuff about what the FBI had done, and I just found out some other stuff last night, oddly enough, I was talking to two friends here about. and I threatened the FBI back. They said they were going to indict my mother for obstruction of justice, and I said, I'm going to investigate you. And I'm going to use the exact same methods that Aaron Barr did for you guys with the DOJ's help, and we'll see if they're legal when I do them. And so they came in. Turns out they were. So the SWAT team came and got me. Long story short, I faced a lot of time in prison. Faced like 105 years worth of charges altogether by the end of that year, by the end of 2012. It takes the press a while to figure out what it is, what this is about. I had a search warrant executed 6 months prior to my arrest. Michael Hastings had posted the search warrant on BuzzFeed, which is not exactly the dark web. It's very easy to find BuzzFeed. They spent a lot of money helping you find it. And he was one of the most prominent journalists in the country at that time. But nonetheless, if you go look at all the coverage a few months after my arrest, none of them have any idea what's going on. They think, oh, he remanded the FBI for some reason. We're not sure why. I spent like 45 minutes in these videos explaining all of this stuff I just explained to you. But they just couldn't, I don't know, some kind of raid. He was involved with Anonymous, we know that. Maybe he hacked the Zeta's servers. Maybe he was a hacker, probably a hacker. I'm still referred to as a hacker on the BBC sometimes. I can't code, I have no technical background whatsoever. Took them a long time to figure it out, so we had to kind of help them along. And so I had people on the outside that we kind of sort of lobbied journalists like Glenn Greenwald and said, hey man, I should know that Glenn Greenwald was one of the journalists that was being targeted by this Team Themis Gary thing. Like he was, by name, they said, people like that, these liberal types, they'll choose career over cause every time, which unfortunately is oftentimes true. We'll target him, we'll push him, he's a supporter of WikiLeaks, we'll push him, we'll do, blah, they named like 12 other journalists that they wanted to go after, including one at the New York Times, which the New York Times never reported for some reason. Anyway, so Glenn Greenwald writes a thing on me, The Nation writes a thing, but they're finally going back and saying, oh yeah, he was up in all this stuff last year, involved these intelligence contracting firms, and oh yeah, there was a search warrant, and it involved those same firms, and they were all caught doing criminal activities, and Congress, there's going to be a congressional investigation, but a Republican from Texas, Lamar Smith, shut it down. He said the DOJ was the one that should decide if a crime been committed. If you remember, the DOJ started this. So it turns out they were not interested in pursuing that particular crime. Anyway, so it eventually came out, and so I became a cause célèbre, thank God, at some point in my arrest, and so we were able to raise money for a defense team, and rather than doing 100 years in prison, I ended up doing 4. But, so you'll remember I'm talking about Palantir. Palantir was one of these firms. It's one of the largest data firms, one of the most important data firms in the world. It's named after some Lord of the Rings bullshit. It's important not because it's a large firm, not because there's a lot of money involved, which comparatively there's not, but because it's an information firm. Because what it does is it provides, aside from looking at people's children, it takes data in the information age and it collates it, and it makes it accessible, makes it usable. It militarizes that information, just like we do. But they do it with a lot more resources and with the help of the CIA and the NSA. And sometimes the private wealthy individuals who believe that we should restore the monarchy, which is what Peter Thiel believes. Or who thinks that barring that, we should have Trump become president, which is what Peter Thiel helps to do later on. So remember all that. Now, New York Times, some of you here may, depending on what your politics are, you may have no problem with Trump, whatever. I'm not going to make any assumptions here. But let's say that you do. Let's say you're the New York Times. And most of your reporters are pretty, if not liberal, they're at least not Trumpians. And you think that the election of Trump is the most mentally scarring thing that's ever occurred in your lifetime, which is kind of one of the things to me, frankly, but to them it definitely is. You would think that you would want to keep close tabs on Palantir. You would think that when, as happened in 2018, a whistleblower comes up from Cambridge Analytica, Christopher Wiley. Cambridge Analytica is a British company. It's run by SCL or SLC, I forget. SCL, I believe, another British company. And they've been around for a while, and they were one of the firms that I had kind of hit upon in 2011. And Christopher Wiley, this guy who was the top-ranking guy at Cambridge Analytica, comes out to the British Parliament and he announces, yes, in the 2016 election in the U.S., and I think in Brexit as well, in the British referendum, Cambridge Analytica worked with Palantir and it worked with companies like Archimedes Global, and they undermined the U.S. election by scraping 50 million information from 50 million U.S. citizens who are Facebook users, and then creating output based on what we found, and tailoring this propaganda output to these individual constituencies in a way that was very effective. You would think that when that happens, if you're at the New York Times, which is the paper of record, the most prestigious publication in the world in many ways, at the Times at London maybe it's more prestigious because it's from London. London's very fancy. You would think that you would want to have a clear idea of what's going on here and what's at stake. You would think you would search your own archives for Palantir or Archimedes and see what else they've done that you reported on, your publication reported on just 7 years prior. But they didn't do that. And so if you read the article in the New York Times that came out in 2018 on this issue that the New York Times is really big on, it's really important to them what happened during the election and you know, how it got Trump in office and all that, you would think we'd do that. There is no mention whatsoever in the New York Times' article in 2018 about what happened with Palantir back in 2011. The fact that Palantir was targeting their own journalists. There's no mention of Archimedes, which is more understandable because none of them reported on Archimedes. I did with the Romas coin thing. We'll get to that in a second. But, and because there's no mention of it, and because no one there seems to be aware of what happened, Palantir was able to do the same thing they did in 2011. In 2011, as you recall, they claimed, oh, we weren't involved in this. Oh, oops, never mind, we were, but it was just this one guy, but we put this guy on leave, and he's very naughty. When the New York Times had moved on in 2011 on that issue, on Palantir having put this guy on leave and blamed it on him being a rogue engineer, they promoted him. New York Times didn't notice. Very few people noticed, but he was promoted. He became their Washington, D.C. liaison. 2018, when the same thing happens, first Palantir says, oh, we weren't involved in this, and then, oh, this one guy was, well, at least one of our guys was. They said, yeah, it's just a single employee, and we're gonna look into this. We're very mad at him. And it works. That should not work in a republic like this, but it works. And that's one of the missed opportunities that we have in the last 7 years. That's one of the ways in which we have signaled, not that you better not get caught doing this stuff, but it doesn't matter if you get caught doing this stuff. Undermine whatever election you want, come after our own journalists, our own publication, come after other journalists, set up other journalists to do prison time. We're going to give them the National Magazine Award, but we're going to forget about why we did that and ignore it afterwards. That's how bad things are, and that's not even a full account of how terrible it is. But Archimedes Global, these other firms that were also involved in these operations, it turns out that they, aside from the Romas coin thing I looked into, which is very similar to what they were doing in the U.S. election back in 2011, which I just sort of handed out there. I tried to give it to the New York Times before I wrote about it. I've got those emails that I've just been going through recently, which is why I'm so emotional these days. They just didn't think it was interesting. You know, it was not as interesting as, say, urban living, like here's these uptown New Yorkers are, they're walking dogs and they're, you know, whatever the feature stuff they put out constantly. The stuff they used to read in bed on Sunday. Just didn't think it was interesting. And so that's what happens. That's what happens when the attention of a powerful, consequential state apparatus like the U.S., when its nervous system, central nervous system, is severed. Over time, when it doesn't care about what it's doing, doesn't pay attention to what it's doing, and allows itself to become not just useless, but does actual harm, as the New York Times did, I think, when it accused me in October 2011 of faking the Mexican drug war, something that made it very difficult for me to raise money later on when I was arrested for looking into the things that they wouldn't look into. There's a whole thing that can go on that. I probably shouldn't. But there's a number of journalists who later on worked for the New Yorker as staff writers, became New York Times' security experts on online propaganda while I was in prison, who had written about me when I was in prison, when I was under a gag order, and repeated those claims, which one of them had already been caught on audio. I recorded him admitting that he didn't actually believe it. He's the guy who found the Internet Research Agency, if you remember that, the Russian troll farm. He found it. In some way. So that's part of the story here. The other part, again, is that these firms aren't going away. We know more about them than we did in 2010, obviously, because we knew nothing about them then. We knew more about them than we did even the height of 2011, when we were all spending all of our time looking into them, just day in and day out, calling up who's Alan Hamilton vice president at 7 o'clock in the morning, and waking them up and recording it and asking them questions they weren't prepared to answer, and getting them to slip up. We know much more now. Even the press knows more now. But the campaign that has to occur against these firms and against the intelligence and surveillance mindset that is held in common in Washington, the Kremlin, and Beijing, it's the same everywhere. That campaign that is necessary if we're going to remain a citizenry rather than a subject population That is not yet kicked off. There are ways in which it can kick off, and there are ways in which all of these things I've just told you about, all these terrible situations, all these terrible elements of phenomena can all be addressed at once very easily. And that involves crowdsourced civics and crowdsourced research. The things that we were able to do back then, they were done because rather than following the model that has existed since 17th century London of a editor and a journalist and maybe a fact checker, that's been updated since then. It's been tried and tested. We tested with Project PM. We had these crowdsourced sort of communities going through this data over and over again for a year, compiling our research and curating it, making sure that it was true, making sure it was checked. But doing that provided an output that was, I think you compare it to what the New York Times did and all these other publications did, and I think you'll find that we, first of all, we were right. We were right in our warnings. We were right about the actual individual companies. And some of these other outlets were not even wrong, because they didn't even talk about them. That's not even the worst thing about the New York Times. But let's move past the New York Times now, and let's get back to the solution. What time is it now?
It's 5 to 3.
Okay, so I'll wrap up in 5 minutes, and then we'll start answering questions. And if no one has any questions, I'll just keep talking, but we'll see what happens. We have ways that have been proven out, not just by the things I was involved in, but other groups like Telecomics, which is another sort of crowdsourced research group that has a wiki, and they have volunteers over years and years, and they're working out of an internet chat room, and they're going over materials, and they're compiling these things into a cohesive body of material that any journalist can come and look at if they want to cover these things. You had Anonymous, you had Occupy Wall Street. Anonymous was always a very flawed thing. It was flawed by nature. It could not be otherwise. But it proved a number of techniques were useful. I'm not talking about hacking as such. Those are useful, but they're not the kind of things I want to encourage. But they do prove that there are people out there who will absolutely, for free, without having to be told by a government or a church or an institution, they will come and they will work together in ways that are formidable enough that the NSA will get freaked out. These are effective things. These are things that we can now do because the internet exists. These are things that we can now do better than we did 10 years ago. They all center on the most important fact of the 21st century, which is that for the first time in human history, any individual can collaborate with any other individual on the planet. And that is a vastly important fact that it's hard to kind of keep it in mind because it's happened so gradually in our view, in our lifetimes. But historically, it's a very sudden change, and it's a very fundamental change because everything we've inherited in terms of nation states, institutions, corporations, gangs, all of these things come from something else in the past. They all kind of flow from a period well past ago. That's the best I can do. And they all came out of a time in which collaboration was vastly limited, in which you have the Kingdom of France, not because that's the thing that makes the most sense, but because you're all the French and you're all here. And you're not able to talk to people in Bombay or Cusco. You are French and you live in a village and you have your means of collaboration, which is what we have, which is what all our civics are, collaboration. They're vastly limited. And so in that limitation, you have these entities come out, you have these structures. And that's why our governments and all governments are what they are. When suddenly that changes and suddenly now you can absolutely find more in common with someone who lives in the Netherlands or in Western China, and you all have the same values, and those values are open society and individual rights vis-a-vis the state, transparency, a lack of tolerance for corruption. When you can find those people and get into the practice of working together and bring in people like myself who didn't have a college degree, couldn't join the Peace Corps, was never going to join the institution, couldn't join the military. Well, I guess I could have, but I don't think they would have wanted me. People like that who may have ideas, or they might have energy, they may want to do something, but it's not being harnessed. There's no way for them to take that idea they might have, or the knowledge base they might have, and bring it and put it in action in 20 minutes, except for Anonymous in 2010, 2011. If you can take that, harness that same dynamic, and make something more cohesive that can last. Anonymous was a jellyfish. Occupy Wall Street was a jellyfish. All of these anti-war movements in the 60s, civil rights movements, they were all more or less jellyfishes. But if you can build an exoskeleton around that jellyfish that grows with it, then the jellyfish is never going to die. It's only going to get larger and larger and more formidable. and eventually it's going to be able to strangle the sharks. That's something that all of the intelligence agencies around the world now understand. They've understood it a lot in the last 10 years. It's why that it turns out there was a lot of intelligence operation. There was a lot of intelligence presence in the same venues we were operating in. We're still learning the extent of that, but even aside from the FBI watching us, even aside from CENTCOM Cyber Division watching us, I actually had a beer about 6 months ago with a guy. One of the guys, he was a special forces guy. He had been recruited into the cyber programs, and they were given very broad perimeters to watch us and try to do something about whatever it was we were going to do next week, because they could never anticipate. You know, and some of those people who watched us ultimately agreed with what we were saying, because they were watching us, they were listening to us. But they know that there's going to be an increased understanding and increased consequences of that understanding in the next few years regarding what this means, regarding what this mass collaboration phenomena, what it leads to, what it can lead to. And some of the things it can lead to are very dangerous. Some of them, they will not just be used by idealistic, you know, people who don't believe in borders or don't believe in, you know, or opposed to corruption. It will be used by ethno-states. It will be used by the Chinese. It'll be used by aspects of the American intelligence community and sort of national security community that are less than wise sometimes in their decisions. It will be used by everyone in different ways, and it's going to happen in your lifetimes. It's going to start happening in the next few years, and it's going to get very, very chaotic, and it's going to be something in which it's best if the people who believe in an open society have it first and best. They have developed these apparatuses whereby this stuff can happen in a curated way that can grow procedurally and maintain its morals and maintain a high quality and grow perpetually. Developing something like that is what I'm now trying to do. You mentioned pursuance. That's our intent, is to develop an apparatus, a framework that can ensure this goes well. But this goes less haphazardly than, say, the press and how they do. If anybody has any questions, we can start with that now. So I better have a question. I'll ask a question to you guys. So, who here thinks that all politicians in the U.S. are basically the same? Who here thinks that there's a great degree of fundamental differences between individual, say, presidential candidates in certain races? Who here just doesn't want to hold their hands up? I wouldn't do it either. I raise my hand. I think it's kind of it's demeaning. I think. Say, raise your hand. Okay, I'm just curious. I'm trying to get this to my audience here. We have a question in the back.
Yeah, you brought up Michael Hastings. I was kind of fascinated with that story.
Right.
So, what wants to see with your friend? I was just.
Yeah. So I've talked about it a bit. So I met him in 2008-9 when I first started Project PM, which was originally into this blogger kind of platform. We had some conversations about what ailed the press. He was like me, was someone who worked at Newsweek and all that, and he was just vastly disenchanted. And that's not just because his wife was blown up in Iraq. It's Beyonce. I mean, that had happened like a year before. It was because he had spent so much time in the institutional press learning how badly it worked and how subject to personality and careerism it was. And so we were trying to find a solution to this. And we talked on and off the next couple of years, and then when I started focusing more on that, I was just going through all the emails actually that were in my discovery. And so I read him a long email about here's what Anonymous is doing, here's why it matters, here's why I think it's going to become more and more important the next year or so. And he was the one I went to when the Tunisian Revolution was going on and there was no coverage, and Anonymous had done this campaign, the purpose of which really was to get the press to pay attention. It was to start bringing the pressure mechanisms that occur when a dictatorship is under assault from its own people. So he was somebody who was always down. I mean, he was down to party in that sense. And he, like I said, he covered my case when the search warrant started coming. He published that. He was unlike most of the people I ended up working with in the press. He understood these issues from the get-go, and had a lot of stature. He's the one who went to Afghanistan, who got General McChrystal. Interestingly, about 2 weeks ago, I met a guy in Dallas socially. He was a vet. He was in Afghanistan. Did 2 tours. Serious PTSD, drug problems, thing from all that. And I asked him, I was going to start talking about Hastings. I said, how do you feel about General McChrystal? He goes, I love that man. I'm like, okay, I'm not going to finish this story. And I understood why he did. He explained to me why he loved McChrystal. But anyway, so Hastings has done a lot of important work, including exposing a propaganda operation by two-star Army generals in Afghanistan to use PSYOPs, same ones we use against our enemies, against visiting senators in order to get them to encourage continued support of the Afghanistan war. I realize you guys are probably all 18, so you were probably born when this war started. And the funny thing is, it's kind of funny in a way, with certain kinds of humor. The war was supposed to be over 18 years ago, and we've gone on all of your whole lives. That's kind of well. Hastings later on, he was obviously, by the time I was arrested, he was already a focus of a lot of attention from both the private and public intelligence and military sectors. He had done a lot to disrupt a great deal of what they were doing, and he was going to, obviously, he was a young guy, he was about my age, and he was going to do more, obviously. And I talked to him in 2013. He had me call him from the jail I was at. I was fighting my case for about 2.5 years in these little jail units. And we talked for about 15 minutes, which is the allotted time for a phone call. And he had had a drug problem for a long time, and an alcohol problem, on and off. He had been sober when I met him for a couple of years. And a couple weeks after I talked to him, he was blown up. He was driving his car. There's a police cruiser in LA that caught this on video. It's speeding by all of a sudden, and it runs into a tree, and it blows up. And the first thing I thought was he must be getting high again. And then, that's what I thought at first. And then I was talking to some people on and off over the next year or so, and with my lawyer and all that as well, getting indications that the FBI was claiming that people had asked if was the FBI looking at this guy, because he had sent some emails to his editors and to people he knew in the week before he died about my cars being tampered with, on something on this big story. He was looking into CIA Director Brennan at that time, plus whatever else he was looking into, plus my case and these companies that we were going after. And the FBI claimed that no, we weren't looking into him. And they had mentioned his name in my gag order hearing, because he was one of the journalists that they had listed, that they had recorded all the phone conversations and summarized in the car. They had mentioned my gag order hearing. The FBI had sent out a FBI agent to a guy in Vermont who they thought was another guy who was using a screen name, who had left a comment saying that I work for the Russians and the Chinese, which I assure you I don't. I hate the Russians. I'm not big on the Chinese. They had enough resources. They could go send an FBI agent to some guy in Vermont and ask him, even when he said, no, I'm not that guy, like, well, let's talk anyway. The idea that they were not looking at Michael Hastings, even though he'd been involved in Project PM, which is listed on my search warrant, from which they called a criminal organization, and was involved to some degree in Anonymous, which also listed on my search warrant, which listed on a lot of people's search warrants and arrest warrants, and had talked to me from prison. The idea that well, first of all, later on, that it was discovered that, yeah, they did actually have a file on Hastings, which is what we assumed to begin with, even aside from what else they were doing vis-a-vis us. And it wouldn't have to be the FBI. The FBI doesn't necessarily have anything to do with it. The FBI doesn't blow people up. But there's any number of people, including a lot of, and I work with a lot of special forces people. I know, and there's a lot that I admire very much, because they tend to know more than the average civilian about what actually happens in the world and how things are. And they also have strong feelings, because for the same reason I have strong feelings, because they've gone through periods of trauma and risk, and they've seen their associates killed or injured or whatever. And there's any number of people that could have and would have killed Michael Hastings. Having said that, I don't 100%. I am not entirely convinced that's what it was. WikiLeaks later came out with this Vault 7 release and claimed, oh look, the CIA has this apparatus for taking control of people's cars remotely. And we already knew there was stuff like that, but what they were talking about had nothing to do with this situation. They were just using it very ghoulishly, as WikiLeaks has done over the years, to use somebody's death to promote themselves. They did that with Aaron Schwartz as well, and then Seth Rich later on. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with those cases, but so I don't know what happened to Michael Hastings, but I do know that that if he was assassinated, the press and the way that they covered it afterwards, just like with everything else, there is no reason to believe that they would be able to detect an assassination, because they're incompetent and careerists. So we will never know, barring an actual different kind of research project than the sort that we see from New York Magazine. But he was a guy who understood a lot of this, just like Aaron Schwartz and some of these other people from back then. He was somebody who anticipated a lot of the problems and solutions before other people had. He was one of the unique. He was a valuable journalist who was an actual journalist. And so that's. Anybody have any questions?
You mentioned in the beginning like 4chan and stuff like that. With like, what have you noticed, and like when did you notice like the development of like fascism and like fascist like groups co-opting like?
So that happened when I was in prison, and so I'm hearing stuff in the 4 years in prison. I'm hearing from people on the outside, occasionally, and people I work with and all that. And they're saying, everything's changing out here. Everything's fucking topsy-turvy, and I get out, and it wasn't until about a month after I got out, I got a call from a guy right after the Atlantic Monthly, and he's asking so tell me about the alt-right and 4chan and how that. I'm like, dude, you know more than that I do now. Like, I'm no longer. That's all mainstream now. Like these things that were underground and kind of like cyber futuristic whatever stuff back in 2009, 2010. Now a yuppie journalist is going to know more than I do about 4chan, and so now I know more about what happened. There's still some things that are up for dispute in terms of was there a cohesive, intentional operation to use 4chan and the /poll/suburb, which is where a lot of this QAnon stuff comes out of, and where a lot of the Trump stuff comes out of. Was that done the same way we're now learning that both the U.S. and Russia sought to harness these existing institutions, these existing phenomenon for their ends? And I've heard different opinions on that, and so some of these things kind of related to that are coming out right now. Like they're in the process of coming out, including stuff about WikiLeaks, Russia, the CIA, some things involving the U.S. media. A lot of it's coming out. Some of it will come out in the Mueller report, some of it won't. Some of it will probably come out from some of the people involved. Some of it will come out from me, I guess. Some will come out about me, apparently. And that's going to be happening next few days. I don't know, but I don't think we're going to know. That's one of the problems here, is that when they have these things like persona management, which is no longer called that, incidentally. If you look at the New York Times article the last few months about a company called Cyber out of Israel that was creating what they call avatars and doing the same thing. It's the same thing. New York Times doesn't know it's the same thing. They don't know what persona management means. They have no idea this has been found before. But when you have those apparatus, it's very hard to detect. It gives you this huge ability, this incredible ability. Even if you're someone like me who has to learn about espionage by virtue of being subject to it and then doing it himself, learn about conspiracies that way. Or if you're an actual, if you're the Russians and you're drawing upon 100 years of doctrine, since the Russians were the ones who really invented a lot of counterintelligence stuff as we know it, out of necessity before the Tsar fell, and developed it since. You have the ability to manufacture events. You have the ability to manufacture, developments, cultural developments. We know a little bit about how that's been done. We don't know how effective it's been in all these cases. We don't know how effective these Facebook operations were. We don't know how effective what Cambridge Analytica did, but they're probably the best at it. We don't know, if it really mattered that Russia was putting these Twitter bots online. We know that they happened to some extent. We don't know, and we only know it to the extent that we can figure it out by open source research. We don't really know what the CIA or FBI is telling us. You can only rely on them to the extent that they're going to show you their research, because they do lie when they feel it's necessary, which is a lot of times, it turns out. But we know that these things are useful. That's why there's so much money being put into them. And we know that, if you had them, if you had your own little operations center with these persona management software that's been around since 2009, if you had the modern iterations, or even the stuff from 2008, you would be able to, in effect, take control of the narrative in the local media. You would be able to manufacture events. You would be able to manipulate and discredit journalists if they were getting too close. You would be able to put them on the wrong track, use them for your own ends. You can do that now. Any good intelligence agent can do that now. Even a bad intelligence agent can do that. But it's going to be able to be done on a more automated basis, and it's going to require less and less human input. And that is where we get to the point where things get past the point of no return. It's going to be, if you think it's difficult now to figure out what the truth is and what's reliable, 5 years from now it's going to be vastly worse. So for what happened at 4chan, we don't know. I mean, but it can be explained quite naturally. I mean, 4chan is like an ecosystem. It's like, if you think of Central Asia between about 100 AD and 1600, you had these febrile populations that every once in a while they would emerge and create these very sophisticated, not just horseback raids, but actual empires. Like the Mongols being the most the most expansive and frankly the most admirable, because the Mongol Empire was a pretty extraordinary institution. But every once in a while they emerge, they get mobilized, they get decided, and they come out and things happen. 4chan was the same way. They put out this sort of libertarian left movement, anonymous essentially, or anarchist left movement, 2008, that within a couple of years you have the head of the NSA, I think it was Keith Alexander, giving a speech about how they're a threat, they'll take over, in 2 years, they're taking over nuclear power plants. I don't think he really believed that, he was trying to get more funding. But you have that movement that did a great deal of important things, and then a couple of years later you have this right-wing movement come out of it and essentially help take over the U.S. For Trump. So that's been noticed, obviously, in various quarters, and so it's there are any number of intelligence agents, just like the word anonymous, trying to use these for their ends. Like I said, we're still learning specifics about some of the things that happened with the FBI and Russia, sometimes combined. Just yesterday, Emma Best, who used to be a WikiLeaks volunteer before, like a lot of people, she left WikiLeaks because it's become a horrible, horrible creature in the last several years. Put out an article about what the FBI, this FBI handler, and this Russian who was a spy for the FSB, and then they arrested him, and they turned him on their side, and then he was involved with Anonymous and infiltrating Anonymous, all this stuff. So, like I said, we're still finding out. My answer, but I would say, just a short answer to a long answer I've already given, is that we don't. It's very possible, but it's also possible it happened naturally. I mean, there are natural tendencies for reaction and counter-reaction, and it was due. The alt-right was due. They had the momentum. They had all the energy they needed. It is, in retrospect, it's not surprising that they were able to take these same techniques, using memes as a cohesive, as a center of, as a culture. Same way that the French have the king of France, or had it. They have Pepe the Frog. That's all you need. All you need is a symbol, a shared symbology, a shared language that differentiates you from the outsiders, and you have a nation state in the wings. And if it's better than a nation state, if it's more agile, which 4chan was, then you have something potentially better, potentially more effective, and more dangerous in this case. And so that's a lesson that has now been learned, and I think will be increasingly understood by people who are a little bit slower on the uptake, in the press in particular, over the next few years, and that's going to change things again.
Historically, the U.S. government, with groups like COINTELPRO, and even which, from what you're talking about, makes them seem like a very small fish in a much larger pond. But moving towards a more transparent model of journalism, do you see, or have you seen so far, that outside groups, if we move towards a more transparent level of journalism, that they will try to dismember that?
So there's several things going on. There are some responses, some of which I'm involved in, some of which I'm not. Tools for making more transparent research, tools for doing some of the things we've been talking about for a while, crowdsourced research in different aspects. These things are all coming out, and there'll be kind of a push for that. And then meanwhile, yes, you'll have, that's something that the intelligence community takes into account. And COINTELPRO, to its credit, that was a massive operation for decades. I mean, they were at some point, and this came out a few years ago in that book, The Burglary, which is about the Catholic, mostly Catholic anti-war radicals who discovered COINTELPRO by burglarizing an FBI station and stealing all their documents. This is back in the old days. We had to actually go there and take the documents. You couldn't just say, hey, hacker, go get them. That was a great operation. They spent a month taking it out. They took them, they got up to the Washington Post and the Congress, and that's what we know about COINTELPRO. But it was a conspiracy theory, now it's established history. They will absolutely, I mean, the press operations, information operations, what they call them in the military, and what we now call them, are fundamental, and so any change in the press dynamics are of relevance. They're of relevance to the way the way media is done in New York is of vast consequence to people sitting in a room in Beijing with the People's Liberation Army. It's all relevant to them. It's relevant in Kremlin. It's relevant among these other more amorphous groups that are either close to the intelligence community of a certain country, they're nationalists, or they're internationalists like myself. It's all relevant to all of us. And so, to the extent it's deleterious, to the extent it impacts what they can do, they're going to look at ways, at the very least, like consider ways, war game ways, to disrupt it or to take advantage of it. My opinion on exactly the extent of what they would do has changed again in the last week, just based on, again, on things that are coming out. I now know a little bit more about what may have happened here in the U.S., including for outlets that I wrote for. That's relevant to that conversation, but it's not my place to go into those yet. But suffice to say that rather than disrupt something, sometimes it's better to take it over. and that's always been doctrine. And that was the Bolsheviks by 1917, the Tsars, you know, but the Okhrana, the Tsars intelligence service, some of the delegates in the Duma, the Bolshevik delegates, were actually secret police. They took it over. They didn't take it over enough. They you know, and that was, you know, has consequences for them. But you know, Stalin himself may at some point have been an informer, a police informer, maybe a snitch, basically, just like Sabu. He was a hacker guy from Anonymous that we don't like. It's all very, when we talk about intelligence operations, it's all very amorphous because you never know what's in somebody's head, and sometimes an operation depends on what's going on with somebody's head. And that's why we never really know much about why did these 5 guys who were Oxford grads, who were the upper class in England, at what point and why did they become Soviet counter agents? You know, the short answer is they're eccentric Englishmen, and they'll do all kinds of stuff like that. The English, you know, they'll betray themselves to some other exotic culture. 10 minutes. They love doing that. I totally understand that. But yeah, so we're always dealing with very amorphous factors of intelligence, and so we're always dealing with ambiguities and uncertainty, and that's important to keep in mind in all aspects of this. That we're always just trying to get to a closer approximation of what happened and what is going to happen, and we are at our best. We are best served by being agile and remembering how uncertain we are about every single aspect of all these things.
You touched on some of the larger media entities quite a bit. How did the smaller, like fringe ones, like say InfoWars or Breitbart, fit into that?
So InfoWars, so Alex Jones was on cable access down in Austin when I lived there, turn of the century. And so the first time I met Alex Jones, it was prank calling him on cable access. We were all sitting around. Austin Cable Access was a great institution. And then a few years later, I actually interviewed him for some other magazine, 2003 or so, and lucky he didn't recognize my voice, luckily. And so back then, we all thought, and when I say we, I just mean me and my friends, my Estonian friends. We all thought that he was sincere, that he meant what he was saying. And we could tell that, first of all, he was kind of a racist. He was in these impressions of Mexicans all the time, right there on TV. And that he was kind of came out of the sort of somewhat of the far right, but also libertarian. But you know, later, since then, I've become much more confused about what his deal is, because it's very odd for somebody to say Rudy Giuliani was involved in 9/11, and then a number of years later, you are working for the Trump campaign, and they have Rudy Giuliani as their lawyer. Like, what happened there, Alex? Like, did you change your mind? You don't need an apology? Are you now for 9/11? Like, you know, so and the tragedy of that, is that things like COINTELPRO, things that involve actual false flag attacks that, you know, are on record. The NSA the CIA have released documents about what they used to talk about, what they planned, what they did. All those things get tainted because Alex Jones is out there saying he's referring to actual events and actual possibilities, and then he's talking about some other crazy shit. And now, when the average press person who's not hugely intellectually curious comes across something like that, they're going to come across it because they heard it from Alex Jones. And so now it's harder and harder for people like me to talk about, you know, mass online propaganda apparatuses, you know, anything he's mentioned. There's this heuristic that people of middling intelligence tend to engage in, which is that if I've heard about something from someone and that other someone is unreliable, that thing is unreliable. They would never say it out loud. They would never write it down. It would be clearly idiotic. But it is how people operate. And particularly the press, where you're someone like Lynn Greenwald, you're getting a lot of emails. You're known for going into some of these issues, and you're getting all these emails. You don't have the time, the resources to investigate every single claim, and some of them are going to seem wacky, you know. But of course, if someone had written to some of the journalists in the '60s saying, "Hey, the government took me and dosed me with LSD, and they experimented on me for several weeks, and then they threw me into a park," you know, for my control research, you're going to say, "Oh, that's kind of crazy." Then a few years later, MK Ultra comes out. And now, thank God, there's a documentary on Netflix called Wormwood about MK Ultra, about some of the things that took place. And those documents have been around for years. So these are difficult issues for the press to get their heads around, and it's going to become more important because the conspiracy, the word conspiracy, the term conspiracy theory, these have connotations that take some nimbleness to really to approach effectively. And without that nimbleness, you're either deciding that you believe all these things are conspiracies, or you're believing that all conspiracy theory is a fundamentally wrong thing or a fundamentally crazy thing. And that's changed in the last 30 years. You go read articles in the LA Times in the early 90s, you're going to see a different kind of language being used about the CIA and crack, for instance, than you would today. You would never see an article or mention about it saying, "Oh yeah, the CIA, it looks like there's indications that they may have sold cocaine in inner cities in the 80s and the early 90s in order to fund these militias in Latin America. That was kind of pretty well known by a lot of mainstream journalists back then. Some people got killed over it, some journalists did. And now it's something that you just not see referenced as a real thing, even though it's somewhat documented. So there's a lot of haphazardness as usual. And on top of that, I did 4 years. And even before that 4 years, I was involved in conspiracies. I mean, Anonymous was an open source conspiracy. We were exposing conspiracies, we were creating conspiracies. We learned a lot about how these things actually operate. And the DOJ, every single day, engages in conspiracy theories when they charge someone with conspiracy, which is a very broad term prosecutors like, usually in drug sales. They say, okay, this guy was selling drugs and these 30 people around him, they're also co-conspirators. It's all one big conspiracy. Press is fine with that. Press believes in conspiracies when they're told this is a real conspiracy. This is DOJ says it is, and they usually are true. These guys usually did sell the drugs. Now, not all the 30 people on the indictment were actually involved in the way the DOJ says. In fact, many of them are rather unlikely to have been involved. They're being charged because, again, they're loved ones of the main target, and they want the main target to please so that they will drop the charges against that loved one. But when the press spends all this time ignoring things, leaving this huge vacuum of human experience, of the act of conspiracy, the act of doing things on the sly for power or for money or whatever, and leaves that like Alex Jones. That whole area is tainted forever. They've abandoned their duty, and now all these things are now, Alex Jones is going to rise. He's going to increase in stature, because he's the one that you have to go to now to learn about the Bilderberg group, which is reported on very little. It's hard to report on because it's a non-transparent group, or Bohemian Grove, which is important in some aspects because it does tell us a lot about the old establishment, kind of what their tendencies are, kind of how they get together, how they communicate with each other, like kind of how they experience power and how they kind of enjoy that experience. It leaves that whole vacuum to be for Alex Jones and even David Icke, who's the lizard guy, fourth-dimensional lizards, English guy. And that's unfortunate, because then when it becomes important again, which it will start to become important with climate change and with the way that powerful people are going to react to climate change, what they're going to do for themselves, that's just the most important aspect of this. It makes it almost impossible for us to act, to document and to act in response. And so it plays into the hands of the people who, unlike the average journalist, is eccentric, understands power, wants power, is ambitious, is creative. Those fall into two different categories. There's the very powerful people who are like that, who will do things that the average journalist cannot imagine someone doing. And there's the people like me, who could be villains, but decided not to be, but who have those same ideas. And so that's why, that's one of the main reasons why the press can't contend with these issues, because they're just not equipped mentally to get in the head of somebody like George H.W. Bush. They're just not. They're not equipped to get in the head of Cecil Rhodes, who captured a whole country and named after himself in the 19th century, Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe. They can't understand people like that. They can't understand the round table groups. And so then Alex Jones comes in and says, oh, the round table group controls the whole world. And they capture babies and then the thing is changed. Then you can't talk about the round table groups anymore, even in a scholarly article. And so that's a tragedy, but it's one of many tragedies that is going to become your tragedy, because I'll be out of this country pretty soon. But have fun. Thank you again for
Thank you very much. So just a couple of really quick things. If you didn't get enough, Barrett will be speaking again tonight at 7 o'clock at Burning Books. These kinds of speakers are made possible in large part due to Professor Pickering, so thank you for your help in making this. This is the first of 4 for this semester, so coming up on April 4th, we have Dawson Barrett, who is a scholar and activist, and his